that. So here I am. A little bit about me. I was the CMO of ConsenSys between 2016 and 2019, which was a really big set of years for the Ethereum ecosystem. Helped build out that ecosystem from the marketing, narrative, PR, branding perspective. And now I've started my own practice and product studio that's serving some of the top projects in the space, which gives me a really unique vantage point into trends like this one. So jumping into fair launches, I think it's hard to talk about fair launches without talking about YFI and where they came from. And that's one of the projects that we're going to be following throughout this talk. We're also going to talk about Based and about Uniswap and SushiSwap. But I think it all got started with YFI. YFI, or Yearn Finance, from Andre Cronje, is the first really well-known example of a fair launch. And YFI popularized the fair launch trend that would be replicated by a lot of other DeFi projects like Based, SushiSwap, Core, Harvest Finance, and Pickle. And there are a lot more, but those are just some examples. You can see Andre Cronje as a Time Person of the Year there. And hopefully, if you don't already know him and YFI, you'll see why by the end of this. But that was the first really known fair launch. So why would you do a fair launch? What kind of problem does it solve? People have observed the negative effects that venture capital has on the ecosystem in terms of token prices and in terms of governance. And we saw a lot of this kind of play out in the 2017-2018 ICO cycle. And you get this meme of VC bags will dump on you. If you launch a token, VCs have huge amounts of these tokens. At some point, they're going to sell them and crush the price. And so people are motivated by wanting to mitigate that effect. We saw a lot of this in that era. And then the other problem with VC ownership is that VCs can often swing a governance vote in their own interest. Oops. Is that image showing up? Hopefully that image is showing up. But this is an example of exactly what we're talking about. I'm not going to mention the exact token project, but this is probably one that you can guess if this is visible. But the market cap of this token project went from 600 million at its peak to 1/10 of that because of probably VCs dumping their tokens at the exact point where it was really starting to gain momentum. So that's something that a lot of token project founders see as a problem. And then an example of VCs being able to swing governance votes, you really see that in MakerDAO, that a few accounts can swing the MakerDAO vote for on-chain governance, and that skews the vote in their own interests, perhaps, which can be misaligned with the interests of the community. So here's another framing of the problem that fair launches solve. They're basically solving for this misalignment between these different groups. So there's the community or the bag holders. Some of them are trying to make money. Some of them really believe in the project, believe in the founders, have a mission-driven reason for participating. Then you get the VCs, which sometimes they're really motivated by the mission of the project, the team, the founders, the goals. But sometimes it's sort of a really limited kind of financial opportunity to them, and they're going to dump or get out of the project whenever it's advantageous for them to do that. Then you get the founders, and you obviously have a really wide range of founder motivations from the worst of the worst, exit scammers, to the best of the best folks that are really just motivated by the technology and taking the ecosystem forward. But even though all of those groups have kind of a range of motivations and interests that they contain, they can get really misaligned, and often that turns into the community ending up holding the bags while the VC or the smart money gets out of the project. And so what fair launches do, by giving everybody the same ability to buy into the project early, by not having any kind of pre-sale or pre-mine, what they're doing is actually collapsing two of those groups. So the investors, or VC, even though it's not going to be professional venture capitalists the way we know and love, the investors, however they're configured, are the same thing as the token holding community. So you're going to collapse those two groups and make sure they're aligned around questions around price and governance interests. And then I don't have the founders exactly aligned with them, and that's actually one of the problems with fair launches that I want to address, which is that the question of founder incentivization. But basically, going from a world where there are these two different groups, this community group and this kind of professional investor class, they have misaligned interests that often lead to negative outcomes for governance, for token price, therefore negative outcomes for the founders and for the project. And so the idea is that fair launches align those incentives. And we have a happy panda here as opposed to a sad panda from the previous way of doing things. But VCs do important things. And so it's important not to jump into the merits of fair launches before addressing, what are we going to potentially lose by doing a fair launch? And these are the roles that VCs have occupied in a capital market sense that are valuable when it comes to launching a tokenized asset. So the first thing that VCs have historically helped with is to generate the asset, and then to set a price for the asset, and then to introduce liquidity for the asset. And that's usually done with the team plus market makers, or investors plus market makers, to help introduce liquidity. But YFI, which is super interesting, proved that you can do all three of those things yourself without VCs by doing it. And they're the first project that I know of that actually did that. And so one is they generated the asset through liquidity mining. So people stake the asset in a pool, and by staking the asset, you generate a new asset. I think YFI was some balancer pool tokens and some other stuff. Then if people, in terms of pricing, if people are interested in the project and think it's good, that may start setting a price for it, but there's likely not that much liquidity yet. So the pricing actually happens kind of dynamically through this whole process. And then the third part is that you can generate more of the asset by staking the asset alongside another liquid asset in something like a Uniswap pool, which introduces liquidity for the assets and also represents some kind of demand for the asset, which contributes back to step two, which is setting the price. So YFI did all of these things and was able to generate the asset, set a price for the asset, and introduce liquidity, all without VCs. Super interesting. That's kind of what a fair launch is. I would define it as, you and the community being able to take all those steps. Woohoo! So if you've done that, then you have fair launched an asset. What you have is a priced asset that's liquid without venture investors involved. And the upshot is that you have less concentration of governance power, less concentration of ownership of the asset, which a lot of people think is a healthier state to have your centralized network in. And so just to reiterate what the advantages are, you have no privileged participants, you have your distribution a lot healthier and wider, and you don't have any VCs who are going to have weird incentives or misaligned incentives and dump on you. So obviously a lot of people are excited about fair launches because it has these incredible advantages, and we've seen lots of DeFi projects using or inspired by fair launch mechanisms, but it's also important to bring back the concerns, and some of these have been mitigated, and some of these are kind of point to larger macro issues and conversations. The first one is the obvious intention with fair launches is to have many more participants with smaller size participation, so you get more kind of diversity, but people can figure out how to game it in order to concentrate the tokens. And we've seen projects trying to innovate and prevent large accounts from mining all at once. We've seen projects try to prevent contract addresses from mining to ensure that the distribution is more even than it would be without those restrictions. Base is an example of trying to counteract some of that gaming the system. They had a restriction on the size of the wallet you could farm with when they were starting. So we've seen the ecosystem start to come up with ways to combat that. Then another drawback is, VC adds more than just finance, than just capital. You don't get the VC connections and the support and mentorship. And basically one thing that Silicon Valley has been doing all these years is figuring out through trial and error what the correct incentive structures are for startup companies. So in Silicon Valley, typically founders are going to start out with like 80% after a first financing, and then they're going to end up with like 20, 30% by the time the startup IPOs after successive financing rounds, which they've determined through a lot of iteration, reaching this equilibrium that's the amount to keep a rock star team incentivized and the interests aligned over time. We see some of these fair launches building in founder shares. We see some not building in any founder shares. You see some like yield wars building in 10% for the founders. But basically, if you're doing a fair launch, you're going to get a lot lower incentives for founders. And you're basically, with that structure, arguing that Silicon Valley is wrong and that the right incentive models is a different one. And that might be true or that might be false. The reason that might be true is because maybe these decentralized networks and teams with on-chain governance, maybe there's a different equilibrium there of what you actually need to be incentivized to do. And so it makes sense that our ecosystem is trying to find a different incentive equilibrium, and maybe that kind of optimal state is different. The flip side of that is, I don't know, I don't want to speak for what Andre is doing or not doing, and as far as I know, he's still working on YFI, but I also know he nearly quit like a month ago because he didn't have as much YFI, and so people gave him some to keep going, which is wild. Now YFI generates real fees, so there's money to pay people with, including himself, but nowhere near if he'd had 10% of that market cap. If he'd had like 10% of that market cap, I think he'd be like 100 millionaire, or imagine like 80%. That'd be wild. So there's a question about the ability to retain talent long term. And then the last one is the question of fair launches eating the world. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's a problem in the context of Uniswap and SushiSwap, which is something that you've probably heard people talking about, or maybe it's new. But the bigger picture of fair launches eating the world is that people believe that anything that can be fair launched will be. The SushiSwap experiment ended really poorly, but theoretically anyone could mount an attack on any existing project that was not fair launched, replicate their code, and replace their token with one that is fair launched. And we saw that happen. I don't know if this slide is showing up, but this is a...
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, great. My view is a little bit different. So Hayden Adams reasonably got upset when everyone took their Uniswap liquidity and was ready to commit over to SushiSwap to get sushi tokens. Some real liquidity from Uniswap did move over, and at one point, the amount of liquidity on SushiSwap was greater than Uniswap. And the idea was, let's take the code of Uniswap and relaunch it with incentives in a fair launch context, and that's what SushiSwap is. And the macro idea is anyone can have the value sucked out like this. Any project that didn't do a fair launch can have this kind of thing happen. And it's not exactly clear how you prevent it, because what kind of moat can your project build around it in order to prevent people from doing this? Maybe it's brand recognition, maybe it's network effects, maybe trust. But in this instance, at least, people didn't necessarily have loyalty to the brand that they knew. They were just happy to move over to where the rewards were. And you can see that that this was reasonably, upsetting. And then it turned into kind of a disaster. So the anonymous founder of the SushiSwap project, Chef Nomi, suddenly removed about $14 million worth of ETH worth of the SushiSwap LP tokens. And people thought that he or she or they had cashed out, had sort of pulled the rug out from under the project, what people have been calling like a rug pull. The value of the project crashed, and people lost a lot of trust in the project, even though the project is still ongoing, and Chef Nomi kind of handed over the keys to somebody else. So this was not a beautiful moment for a fair launched version of an existing project really working. This is a funny question. So obviously fair launches are pretty new, but this space moves so quickly that some people are already asking if fair launches are over. And between lack of incentives for founders like Andre and bad outcomes in projects like SushiSwap, is this trend over? And my answer to that is obviously no, I don't think so. I think innovation in pricing and liquidity for new tokens is actually just beginning, and fair launches just represent the beginning of that new kind of track of innovation that we're seeing in DeFi. And there's great evidence of this. We're seeing projects like Based and Core and more continuing to innovate with how pricing and liquidity work for their new tokens. In terms of investors, I haven't seen a lot of traditional VCs getting set up properly to be able to participate in fair launches early, like a bunch of individuals have been able to. But at the same time, we're seeing some new forms of investors and funds like Framework Labs, Paradigm, Neptune actually hasn't launched yet, but something cool coming soon. And then in terms of market timing, that's something else that's promising. As long as there's the perception, and I think also the truth, that we're heading into this bull market cycle, that brings a lot of innovation and momentum, and we're going to see more people kind of coming into the space and wanting to iterate on these ideas about pricing and liquidity. And then talent. One thing I'm definitely seeing is that top founders are considering fair launches and aren't necessarily looking to VC in the way that they used to be. So really just watching what kind of top talent and top technical innovators in the space are doing and caring about is a great way to figure out which trends are going to have longevity. All right. So thank you. Thank you for having me. Thanks for having me speak again. I'm on Twitter at Amanda Cassett. I'm on Telegram at Amanda Claire. And my practice is called Serotonin. Thanks so much.